The grip of drought that is intensifying in the West has led scientists to turn to an unusual ally in the fight to limit the effects of climate change. We're talking about the largest rodent in North America, the beaver.
25 degrees Celsius. That single number was a death sentence for every steelhead trout trying to survive in a stretch of Oregon high desert stream called Bridge Creek. It sounds almost too specific to matter, but for a cold water fish clinging to existence in a warming watershed, that temperature was the line between life and extinction, and by the late 2000s, Bridge Creek was crossing it every summer afternoon. This is a story about a river that had, in effect, been strangled. Not by drought alone, and not by a single dramatic event, but by more than a century of slow, compounding damage that turned a living wetland into something closer to an open wound cut into the desert floor. And it is a story about the strange, almost accidental solution that a small group of scientists tried in 2009. Instead of bringing in bulldozers, engineers, and millions of dollars, they hammered a few hundred wooden posts into the streambed, wove willow branches between them, and stepped back to see what would happen. What happened next has become one of the most studied and most quietly astonishing restoration stories in modern stream ecology. To understand why this worked, you first have to understand what Bridge Creek used to be, long before anyone thought to intervene. This tributary of the John Day River, tucked into the dry rangeland of eastern Oregon, was once part of a much older pattern that shaped rivers all across North America. Before European trappers arrived, beavers were not a rare, charming curiosity in western streams. They were, by some ecological estimates, present in numbers reaching into the hundreds of millions across the continent, and their dams were everywhere. Wherever beavers settled, they transformed narrow, fast-moving channels into wide, shallow, braided wetlands, slowing water down, spreading it across the valley floor, and letting it soak deep into the soil like a sponge holding moisture through the dry months. That sponge effect mattered more than people often realize. It meant that even in a place as parched as the high desert of eastern Oregon, groundwater stayed close to the surface long into summer. Willows and cottonwoods along the banks kept their roots in reach of moisture. Fish had cool, shaded pools to retreat into when the sun turned the open water into a furnace. The whole system depended on one animal quietly doing the same job, generation after generation, without anyone noticing or thanking it. Then came the fur trade. Throughout the 1700s and 1800s, trappers moved across the American West with a singular commercial goal, and beaver pelts were among the most valuable commodities driving that expansion. Entire watersheds were trapped out, sometimes deliberately, to create what trapping companies called a fur desert, a stretch of land stripped of beavers so thoroughly that competitors would have no reason to move into it. Bridge Creek's beaver population, like so many others, was decimated. And once the dams stopped being built and maintained, the physics of the stream began working against it. Without dams to slow it down, water moving through a valley starts to cut downward into its own bed. Livestock grazing compounded the damage further, as cattle trampled and browsed the willow and cottonwood shoots that would otherwise have anchored the banks and fed the few beavers that remained. Over decades, this created a self-reinforcing cycle that ecologists sometimes describe as channel incision. Faster water erodes the streambed more aggressively. A deeper channel concentrates the same volume of water into a narrower space, which makes it move even faster. That faster water cuts the channel deeper still. Each spring flood made the following year's damage worse, and by the time scientists began seriously monitoring Bridge Creek in the mid-2000s, the stream had carved itself into a trench several meters below the surrounding land, a stark vertical-walled scar running down the valley floor. The water table beneath the adjacent terraces had dropped so far that the streamside vegetation was dying of thirst, even though a stream still technically ran nearby. The roots simply couldn't reach it anymore. Remarkably, a handful of beaver colonies had survived in this degraded system, and they never stopped trying to do their job. Researchers monitoring the watershed in the years before the restoration project found that beavers were still attempting to build dams virtually every year. But the material available to them was thin, weak willow regrowth, because the mature woody vegetation that once lined the banks had been grazed and eroded away. Studies from this period documented failure rates for natural beaver dams on in-size streams like this one running as high as roughly 80 to 90% within just a few years. The animals weren't failing because they'd lost their instincts. They were failing because the physical conditions of the stream had been pushed so far outside the range they evolved to work within that their usual building materials and techniques could no longer hold against the force of the water. This is the insight that shaped everything that followed, developed through the work of researchers including Michael Pollock of NOAA Fisheries, along with Nicholas Weber, Nicholas Buwes, and Joseph Wheaton, whose research through Utah State University helped formalize the science behind what became known as beaver dam analogs. The team recognized that Bridge Creek didn't need more beavers introduced from elsewhere, and it didn't need a conventional multimillion-dollar engineering overhaul either. It needed something much simpler, a temporary boost that would let the beavers already living there do the work they were already trying, and failing, to do. So in 2009, crews walked into the creek and began building. The structures they installed, now widely known in restoration science as beaver dam analogs, or BDAs, were deliberately crude by engineering standards. Wooden fence posts were driven vertically into the streambed using handheld pneumatic or hydraulic post pounders, spaced a matter of inches apart across the channel. Willow branches and other woody debris were then woven horizontally between the posts, creating a loose, porous lattice rather than a solid wall. Unlike the rigid watertight barriers used in conventional stream engineering, these structures were designed to leak. Water was meant to trickle through the weave during low flow and spill safely over the top during high flow, rather than slamming against an immovable surface and blowing it apart. That porous, yielding design turned out to be the entire key to the project's success. Conventional restoration structures, built from concrete or anchored boulders and logs, resist floodwater by force, and when a flood exceeds their design threshold, the accumulated energy tends to concentrate at a weak point and cause catastrophic failure. The beaver dam analogs did the opposite. By allowing water to pass through and over them, they dissipated energy rather than absorbing it all at once, giving them a much better chance of surviving the very floods that had been destroying natural beaver dams on this creek for years. The response from the resident beavers was almost immediate. Within the first season, researchers observed beavers investigating and building onto a meaningful share of the artificial structures, reinforcing them with their own sticks and mud in the same way they would repair a natural dam. Nobody trained them to do this or guided them toward specific locations. The behavior was simply what beavers do when they sense the particular acoustic and hydraulic signature of pond water, an instinct that predates human agriculture by millions of years. The true test came with the first major spring runoff following installation. This was the exact seasonal event that had been shredding natural beaver dams on Bridge Creek for decades, and if the artificial structures failed the same way, the entire approach would have been discredited before it had a chance to prove itself. Instead, monitoring showed that the majority of the beaver dam analogs survived the flood essentially intact. Water passed through and over them as designed. Some structures suffered minor breaches at the edges, and in the following weeks, beavers were observed patching those breaches themselves, using the surviving frame as a foundation rather than starting from nothing. That distinction between repairing damage and rebuilding from scratch is what allowed the recovery to compound rather than reset every single year. As sediment began settling behind the surviving structures instead of racing straight through the trench, the streambed itself began to rise. Monitoring wells recorded measurable increases in the local water table, in some locations reportedly climbing by a foot or more in the years following installation. That rising water table reached back up into the root zones of streamside willows and cottonwoods that had been stranded on dry terraces for years, and the vegetation responded the way starved plants generally do once they can reach water again. It grew. Fresh willow shoots, the very material beavers need to build effectively, became available in far greater quantity than the colonies had seen in a generation, feeding directly back into the beavers' ability to build stronger dams of their own. Over the following years, researchers documented a steady expansion of both the constructed structures and the number of entirely independent, beaver-built dams appearing throughout the watershed, including in tributaries and side channels the restoration crews had never physically touched. This is the detail that transformed the project from a modest habitat intervention into something closer to a self-sustaining ecological engine. Each new dam, whether human-assisted or fully wild, reduced the flood energy reaching the dams downstream, making each subsequent structure more likely to survive. The same feedback loop that had spent a century grinding the stream down into a lifeless trench was now running in reverse, and this time it required no ongoing funding to keep going. Satellite and aerial monitoring over the following decade documented substantial increases in wetted stream surface area across the treated reaches, along with measurable greening of streamside vegetation visible in remote sensing data. The stream was, quite literally, reclaiming ground it had abandoned generations earlier, spreading back out across a floodplain that had been dry since the days when trappers first moved through this landscape. Perhaps the most counterintuitive result, and the one that mattered most for the threatened steelhead this project was ultimately trying to protect, involved water temperature. Conventional stream ecology holds that ponding water behind a dam tends to warm it, because slow, shallow, sunlit water heats up faster than a narrow, fast-flowing channel. Researchers going into this monitoring genuinely worried that hundreds of new impoundments might push Bridge Creek's already dangerous summer temperatures even higher, potentially finishing off the very fish population the project aimed to save. The data told a different story. Published monitoring found that summer maximum temperatures in the beaver-dammed reaches actually declined, in some records by roughly 2 degrees Celsius on average, with far greater variation recorded across short distances within the dam complexes themselves. The explanation traces back to the hypereoic zone, the layer beneath a streambed where surface water and groundwater exchange through the spaces between gravel and cobble. In a deeply incised, scoured channel, that exchange nearly stops, because there's no pressure differential driving water down into the substrate. The weight of pond water behind hundreds of beaver dams restored that pressure, pushing warm surface water down into the gravel, where it cooled in the shaded subsurface before re-emerging downstream as comparatively cold seepage. In effect, the beavers had rebuilt a natural, distributed cooling system for the stream, entirely as a byproduct of their ordinary dam-building behavior. There was a second fear tied to fish passage, since dams are historically associated with blocking migratory fish rather than helping them. But tracking data on tagged spawning steelhead found that passage rates through the beaver complex reaches remained comparably high before and after the restoration, in part because the porous, leaky design of the structures created plunge pools, side channels, and resting spots that gave migrating fish places to pause and regain strength rather than forcing them through one continuous, unbroken gauntlet of fast water. Longer-term monitoring published roughly 8 years after the initial installation documented substantial gains in juvenile steelhead survival, population density, and overall fish biomass in the treated reaches relative to untreated control sections of the watershed, findings that helped establish beaver dam analogs as one of the more effective and closely studied tools available for salmonid habitat restoration in the region. And the cost of achieving all of this was strikingly modest compared to conventional engineered stream restoration, which for comparable stretches of degraded channel can run into the millions of dollars and often requires ongoing maintenance to keep structures functional. The original wooden posts and willow weavings at Bridge Creek were never meant to last forever. They were scaffolding, a temporary head start designed to hold the line just long enough for the resident beaver population to take over the job permanently. Many of those original structures have since decayed or been buried under sediment, which researchers regard not as a failure but as evidence the system succeeded, because the beavers had long since replaced them with dams of their own design, built with no outside funding and no expiration date. What Bridge Creek ultimately demonstrated wasn't simply that beavers are useful, something naturalists and indigenous communities across North America understood long before any formal ecological study confirmed it. It demonstrated something more specific and more broadly applicable, that a badly degraded natural system, locked for a century into a cycle of self-reinforcing decline, could be nudged back toward recovery with an intervention far smaller and cheaper than anyone expected, provided the right biological engine was still present and simply needed a foothold sturdy enough to survive its first season. The approach pioneered here has since spread to watersheds across Washington, Idaho, Utah, Nevada, and California, with land management agencies increasingly incorporating beaver dam analogs into their restoration toolkits. There's something worth sitting with in that outcome. For 100 years, the assumption in stream restoration was that fixing a broken river required overpowering it, matching its destructive force with concrete, steel, and heavy machinery. Bridge Creek suggested something closer to the opposite, that sometimes the most effective intervention is not to fight the system at all, but to identify the one component still trying to do its job despite impossible odds, and give it just enough support to finally succeed. The beavers of Bridge Creek never stopped trying to save their stream. They simply needed someone to notice, and to hand them a chance that could survive one more spring.